There are numerous myths about ancient cities and even entire civilizations which were very powerful in the past and yet somehow managed to disappear without a trace. How is that possible? What is the real story behind this? Is there some basis of truth, or are they just lies and fancies? In this third and final episode of our series on Greek mythology, we are going to talk about the most famous of all lost civilizations, Atlantis. The origin of the Atlantean legend is believed to be a visit by the famous Greek legislator Solon to Egypt, where some decrepit priests told him about an ancient tale regarding his own nation. When he returned to Athens, Solon recounted this story to several other figures, who then spread it further. One of these was Dropides, who told it to his grandson Critias. Later, around the year 360 BC, that same Critias, the future tyrant of Athens, a Syracusan general named Hermocrates, and three famous philosophers, Timaeus, Socrates and Plato, got together to drink some wine, eat some olives and philosophize. Well, actually, that meeting only took place in Plato's head, since the other characters had been dead for over 40 years.
I see dead people.
But the key point is that this conversation, perhaps fictional or perhaps remembered, is when the topic of Atlantis first came up. It was collected in two of Plato's famous dialogues, Timaeus and Critias. According to these writings, in the words of Critias, as told to him by his grandfather, Atlantis had been a great military power, which had been at its peak 9,000 years earlier. They had abundant natural resources, like all kinds of animals, especially bulls and elephants, and also unlimited timber and the famous orichalcum, or mountain copper, which was thought to be a super shiny natural alloy of copper and gold. The location of Atlantis is not indicated precisely, but the dialogue places it beyond the Pillars of Hercules, or in other words, the Straits of Gibraltar, and it is described as being larger than Libya and Asia combined. Bear in mind, though, that for the ancient Greeks, Asia reached up to India, since that was all they knew. And perhaps when they said Asia, they were referring just to the Anatolian peninsula. But in any case, it seems that the lost continent was enormous. The myth says that the first inhabitants of Atlantis were Evenor, born from the earth, and his wife Leucippe. The sea god Poseidon fell in love with their daughter Cleito, and together they produced the lineage of Atlantean kings. They had 10 children in total, and so the island was divided into 10 kingdoms. The eldest of those children was Atlas, who lent his name to the land of Atlantis and also to the surrounding Atlantic Ocean. Just a quick but important note here, this Atlas is not the same as the Titan Atlas, who was condemned to hold up the skies by Zeus and for whom the Atlas Range in Morocco is named, as we saw in previous episodes. Atlas had a twin brother, Gadirus, who gave his name to the settlement of Gadira, which is the modern-day city of Cádiz in Spain. Back in Atlantis, Poseidon created several concentric canals to protect the land, and the 10 royal siblings raised magnificent temples in honor of their mother Cleito and their father Poseidon. They also built a stele of orichalcum where they inscribed all the country's laws, sort of an Atlantean version of the Code of Hammurabi. The Atlanteans were a great civilization, but as the centuries went by, their kings became increasingly arrogant and sought to expand their domains. They reached Europe up to Etruria and Africa up to Libya. Then they tried to conquer Egypt and Greece, but at that point the Athenians beat them back. This is one of the strange parts of the story, since this supposedly happened during an age well before the Greeks existed, let alone Athens. Anyway, the legend then says that after the military defeat, a massive but undetermined catastrophe, some believe a flood, wiped out the entire continent and civilization of Atlantis overnight. Boom! At this point, Critias' story is interrupted and the narrative is left unfinished. It seems that Plato had intended to write a third dialogue called Hermocrates, whose turn it was to intervene after Critias, but he never got round to it. Returning to our story, after the Athenian victory against the Atlanteans, the legend was gradually forgotten by the Greeks for several millennia, until it eventually reached Solon. This story had always been considered a myth, but during the Renaissance, with the renewed interest in Greek classics, there started to appear multiple theories which sought to uncover the elements of truth hidden in the legend. Some even believe that the real reason why Columbus wanted to sail across the Atlantic was to find the remains of this once great civilization. Eventually, the tale reached ordinary citizens, exploded in popularity, and became firmly ingrained in the collective imagination, where it has remained ever since. For example, in 1869, Atlantis appeared in Jules Verne's super famous novel 20,000 Leagues Under the Seas. In 1883, American writer and politician Ignatius Donnelly published The Antediluvian World, where he argued that Atlantis had indeed existed and its remains were the Azores Islands. According to his theory, this civilization had been the origin of all human cultures. The Atlanteans were supposed to be a very advanced primeval race who disseminated their knowledge to the east and the west, from Egypt to South America. And that would be the reason why humans on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean built pyramids, and their cultures featured similar symbols, like snakes, which were worshipped and feared in most early human religions.
I hate snakes!
All in all, while Donnelly significantly contributed to the popularity of the myth, he is also the reason why there is so much kooky, crackpot rubbish around it nowadays. More recently, in 1999, author Jim Allen said that the remains of Atlantis lie in Bolivia, specifically in the Bolivian Altiplano, in a rectangular flatland next to Lake Poopó and Pampa Auyagas. And just to make things a little bit more interesting and mysterious, it turns out that in the ancient Aztec language, Atl means water, while in Inca, Antis means copper. It almost seems too much for this to be a simple coincidence.
Coincidence? I think not!
Then again, that region is full of mysteries, like strange ruins in Lake Titicaca and the city of Tiahuanaco, which we may talk some more about in future videos. Even the Nazis believe in Atlantis. They traveled all over the world in search of the origins of the Aryan race, which they linked with the Atlanteans in order to justify their superiority over the rest of Europe. One of the places they searched was Tibet, which was a relatively unknown region at the time, since it was isolated up in the Himalayas. According to the Nazi narrative, that is where the survivors of Atlantis had taken refuge, shunning all contact with the rest of the world for several millennia. In addition, Hitler's party and the Full Society took inspiration from the symbols of Hinduism, and they also believed in Hyperborea, the mythical land located in the north of Europe, which we mentioned in previous episodes. The Nazis thought that the Hyperboreans had been the primeval inhabitants of the world, and that when their civilization collapsed, they created a subterranean kingdom known as Agartha, supposedly located under the Himalayas and the Gobi Desert, whose capital was the mythical city of Shambhala.
Cobra Law!
No, Shambhala. Another idea that came up during the 19th century contemplated the possibility that the Atlantean civilization may have been the same as the mysterious Tartessians located in southern Spain. This theory says that their cities were buried by a huge tsunami. In 2005, researchers investigated the area with ground-penetrating radar and satellite imaging, and they reported some initial and promising findings, including buried structures which appeared to be man-made. But don't get your hopes up, because that region is a protected reserve, the beautiful natural park of Doñana, so archaeological digs are completely out of the question, especially since it's not 100% clear what the heck is down there. It could well be just a funky rock formation. Another element that comes up in the connection between Atlantis and the Tartessians is a circular design found in the ruins of Canchorroano in the neighboring region of Badajoz. Some connect those concentric circles with the reported architecture of Atlantis, but then again, it could also be just a shield or something like that. In fact, it's not even clear whether this site is truly a Tartessian town, since there is precious little knowledge about that culture. What we do know is that the Phoenicians taught them metallurgy, and they later became very famous for it, and that could be a connection with the legendary Orichalcum. But their trail completely disappeared around the year 500 BC, following the reign of their supposed last king, Arganthonios, and nobody really knows what happened to the Tartessians. Some say that they were conquered and absorbed by the Carthaginians, while others believe that their civilization was destroyed by a tsunami, which buried most of their settlements. As you can see, when it comes to Atlantis, there are plenty of theories, but no certainties. Many scholars think that Plato made up the entire Atlantean myth, or else took different elements of other much older myths, in order to create an allegory. But an allegory of what? Well, at that time, Athens was embroiled in the Peloponnesian War, the famous battle royale with all the Greeks killing each other. It could be that Plato sought to promote unity with this mythical tale of ancient Greeks joining forces to defeat a common, super powerful enemy like Atlantis. Or perhaps it was the complete opposite, and maybe he was criticizing the imperialism that the Delian League was pushing around the Aegean Sea. And then another theory says that Plato just used the mythical Atlantis as an ideal model of a perfect, wise and fair society, since this was something that he was obsessed with, as we can read in his famous work, Republic.
I welcome you all to Cloud Cuckoo Land!
In terms of solid evidence, as we explained in an episode of the Spanish Channel, in 1900 archaeologist Arthur Evans discovered the Palace of Knossos, and that enabled us to learn about the Minoan or Cretan civilization. Years later, many people began to draw up theories identifying this pre-Hellenic culture as the origin of the Atlantean myth. Since it was an island, it had luxurious palaces and their society was considerably advanced. And they also had many bulls, although no elephants that we know of. The last piece of the puzzle was the eruption of a volcano in the neighboring island of Thera, sometime between 1600 and 1400 BC. Although it didn't completely wipe out the Minoan civilization, it definitely left it severely damaged. This may have been the terrible catastrophe that, according to the myth, sent Atlantis to the bottom of the sea.
Under the sea.
As we said at the beginning, Atlantis is not the only case of a lost civilization. Towards the end of the 19th century, there emerged the theory of Lemuria, a lost continent in the Indian Ocean which sought to explain why there were fossils of lemurs and other very similar animals in both Madagascar and India, on opposite sides of the Indian Ocean. And we also have the lost continent of Mu, which is pretty much the same story, but this time in the Pacific Ocean. An officer in the British Army in India, James Churchward, posited the existence of this lost continent of Mu after allegedly deciphering, with the help of Hindu priests, some ancient tales of a mother civilization which had fallen into disgrace. With this, he sought to explain artistic, religious and linguistic similarities between the civilizations of the Indus Valley, Egypt, Mesopotamia, pre-Columbian cultures in South America and Easter Island. The interesting thing is that the inhabitants of Easter Island, or Rapa Nui as they call it, also have a story about a mythical island called Haiva, which they originally came from. And in fact, so do the Polynesians, although they call it Hawaiki. But unfortunately for myth lovers, 60 years later, all of these theories about giant islands and lost continents in the middle of the ocean were completely ruled out by the conformation of plate tectonics. Nevertheless, some people still view things like the mysterious submarine structures of Yonaguni in Japan as evidence that there was once a civilization that we modern humans know nothing about. In all likelihood, Atlantis is just a myth, a fictional story, but it is true that very often such tales have some kernel of truth. Just look at the example of Heinrich Schliemann, an enthusiast of Greek mythology who got it into his head that he would find the mythical city of Troy or eat his shoe. Although he was mocked by everyone, he set out to meticulously follow the tale of the Iliad and eventually ended up discovering the buried ruins of the city in 1871. Nowadays, Troy is no longer a myth. It has become a part of history. Will Atlantis be next? And the rest is history. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave us a big like. Take care, and I'll see you in the next video.